In the 3rd century after Christ, a Persian prophet named Mani sat down and listed the 4 greatest empires on earth. He wrote Rome, he wrote Persia, he wrote China, and then he wrote a name that most people alive today have never heard. He wrote Aksum. That kingdom minted gold coins stamped with a cross before most of Europe knew what Christianity was. It raised stone towers taller than any obelisk in Rome, carved from single blocks of granite, hauled from quarries no one can identify. It controlled a trade network that stretched from the ivory forests of Central Africa to the silk markets of southern India. For nearly 700 years, it dominated the western shore of the Red Sea, the corridor between 3 continents, the hinge upon which ancient commerce turned. And then, sometime around the 10th century, it vanished. Not conquered by a famous empire, not buried by a volcano, not frozen in ash like Pompeii. It simply faded, like a language no one speaks anymore, until the world forgot it had ever existed. Today, when people think of ancient Africa, they think of Egypt. They think of pyramids, pharaohs, and gold masks. Almost no one thinks of Ethiopia. Almost no one imagines that in the highlands east of the Nile, a kingdom once stood that the Romans themselves considered an equal. This is the story of that kingdom. This is the story of Aksum. To understand how Aksum rose, you must first understand the land that made it possible. The Horn of Africa is not what most people imagine when they think of the continent. There are no endless savannas here, no sweeping deserts at the point where Aksum was born. Instead, there is a massive plateau, a block of highland terrain that rises between 2 zoazoeros and 3 000 meters above sea level, sliced by deep river gorges and ringed by escarpments so steep that early travelers compared them to fortress walls built by the earth itself. The air is cool at that altitude. Rain falls in predictable seasons. The soil, fed by volcanic minerals deposited over millions of years, is dark and rich. Barley, wheat, and teff, the tiny grain unique to Ethiopia, grew well here long before anyone organized a kingdom. To the east, the plateau drops sharply toward the Afar Depression, one of the hottest and lowest places on the planet, where the Earth's crust is pulling itself apart and lakes of sulfur glow yellow under a white sky. Beyond that depression lies the Red Sea. And the Red Sea, in the ancient world, was everything. It was the highway. Every ship carrying incense from southern Arabia, every vessel loaded with ivory and gold dust from the African interior, every merchant hoping to reach India or return from it, had to pass through the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, at the southern end of the Red Sea. Whoever controlled the ports along that coastline controlled an artery of global trade. The Egyptians had known this for millennia. The Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander, had built trading posts along the western Red Sea shore. But the Ptolemies governed from Alexandria, thousands of kilometers to the north. They could project naval power, but they could not hold the interior. The highlands were too remote, too vertical, too foreign. The people who lived on that plateau had been trading long before any Mediterranean power arrived. Archaeological evidence from sites near the modern city of Aksum, in what is now the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, shows that by the first millennium before Christ, a sophisticated culture had already taken root. Inscriptions in a script related to South Arabian writing suggest deep connections across the Red Sea with the kingdoms of Yemen, particularly the Sabaean civilization, the people the Bible associates with the Queen of Sheba. Whether colonists from Arabia founded the first highland settlements, or whether indigenous African populations adopted Sabaean cultural elements through trade, remains one of the most debated questions in East African archaeology. The truth, as with most origin stories, is probably somewhere in between. What is certain is that by the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, a new power had consolidated itself on the plateau. It was centered on a city called Aksum, located about 200 kilometers inland from the Red Sea port of Adulis. The people spoke Ge'ez, a Semitic language written in a script called Ethiopic, one of the very few original alphabets ever developed on the African continent. They did not call their kingdom Aksum. In their inscriptions, they called it the Kingdom of the Aksumites, and their ruler bore a title that would echo through Ethiopian history for 2,000 years. He was the Negus, the king. And in the centuries to come, some of those kings would claim an even grander title, one that would have made the emperors of Rome pause. They called themselves Negusa Nagast, King of Kings. The rise of Aksum was not an accident of geography alone. Geography provided the opportunity, a fertile plateau above a critical sea lane, but it was human engineering that turned opportunity into empire. The key was the port of Adulis. Located on the western coast of the Red Sea, near the modern Eritrean city of Massawa, Adulis became one of the busiest harbors in the ancient world. A Greek-speaking Egyptian merchant, whose name we do not know, visited Adulis sometime around the year 50 after Christ and recorded what he saw in a remarkable document called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a kind of commercial travel guide to the Indian Ocean trade routes. He described Adulis as a thriving market where ivory, rhinoceros horn, hippopotamus hide, tortoise shell, and obsidian flowed out of Africa, and where Roman glass, Egyptian linen, Indian iron, and Arabian wine flowed in. The ivory, he noted, came from the interior, brought down from the highlands by the king of the Aksumites. This was not a peripheral trade. Aksum sat at the junction of three commercial worlds. To the north, the Roman Empire's insatiable appetite for luxury goods drove demand. To the east, across the Indian Ocean, the markets of India and Sri Lanka offered spices, gems, and steel. To the south and west, the African interior supplied raw materials that no other continent could match. Ivory above all, but also gold dust, enslaved people, exotic animals, and aromatic resins. Aksum did not merely participate in this network, it orchestrated it. The kings taxed the caravans descending from the plateau. They taxed the ships docking at Adulis. They minted their own coinage, first in bronze, then in silver, and finally, by the early 4th century, in gold. The gold coins of Aksum are among the most beautiful and least known artifacts of the ancient world. Small discs bearing the portrait of the king, surrounded by stalks of wheat, inscribed in Ge'ez. At a time when most kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa conducted trade through barter, Aksum was issuing standardized currency that circulated as far as India and the eastern Mediterranean. These coins were not mere symbols. They were statements. They said to Rome and Persia and every merchant who handled them that Aksum was not a tribal chiefdom on the edge of the known world. It was a state. It was an empire. It expected to be treated as one. And then the kingdom did something that no one, not even Mani the prophet, could have predicted. It became Christian. The story of Aksum's conversion is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of religion. Around the year 316 after Christ, a young man named Frumentius arrived in the kingdom. He was not a missionary. He was a shipwreck survivor. According to the historian Rufinus, writing a century later, Frumentius was a boy from the Roman city of Tyre, in modern Lebanon, traveling with his uncle Meropius on a merchant vessel bound for India. The ship stopped at a Red Sea port, possibly Adulis, and something went wrong. The crew was killed. Only Frumentius and his brother Aedesius survived. They were brought to the court of the Aksumite king, where their education and literacy made them valuable. Frumentius eventually rose to become a trusted advisor, possibly treasurer, to the royal household. When the king died, and his son Ezana was still a child, Frumentius served as regent and began quietly introducing Christianity to the court. King Ezana. That name deserves to be spoken slowly. Ezana is to Ethiopian history what Constantine is to Roman history, and the parallel is not accidental. Just as Constantine legalized and promoted Christianity in the Roman Empire around 312 after Christ, Ezana adopted Christianity as the state religion of Aksum around 330 after Christ, making Ethiopia one of the first kingdoms on earth to officially embrace the faith. The evidence is carved in stone, literally. Ezana's early inscriptions invoke the old gods of Aksum, the triad of Ma'arem, Beher, and Meder. His later inscriptions invoke the Lord of Heaven, the Lord of Earth, using language unmistakably Christian. On his coins, the old disk and crescent symbol, likely representing the moon god, disappears. In its place appears the cross. Aksum's gold coins became the first coins in history to bear the Christian cross, decades before Rome did the same. But Ezana was not merely a convert. He was a conqueror. Around the year 350, he launched a military campaign against the kingdom of Meroe, the last remnant of the ancient Kushite civilization that had once rivaled Egypt itself. Meroe, located along the Nile in what is now Sudan, had been declining for generations, weakened by environmental degradation and shifting trade routes. Ezana's armies marched northwest, crossed the Atbara River, and destroyed what remained. His victory inscription, discovered at Aksum and written in Ge'ez, Greek, and the South Arabian script, is one of the most important documents in African history. In it, Ezana describes burning cities, scattering populations, and seizing cattle and prisoners. He does not boast the way Assyrian kings boasted. His tone is measured, almost administrative. He records the destruction the way a bureaucrat records a completed project. The inscription tells us something crucial about Aksum. This was a kingdom that thought in multiple languages, that carved its victories in 3 scripts so that 3 different audiences could read them. It was cosmopolitan in a way that defies the stereotype of ancient Africa as isolated from the wider world. Nearly 2 centuries after Ezana, another king would push Aksum's power to its absolute limit. His name was Kaleb, and he reigned in the early 6th century. Kaleb was a warrior saint, a figure so revered by the Ethiopian church that he would later be canonized. His great act was an invasion not of Africa, but of Arabia. In 523, a Jewish king named Du Nuwas seized power in the kingdom of Himyar, in what is now Yemen, and began persecuting the Christian community there. Reports of massacres reached Kaleb across the Red Sea. Whether motivated by genuine religious outrage, by strategic interest in controlling both sides of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or by both, Kaleb assembled a fleet and an army and crossed the water. The invasion of 525 was a massive operation. Byzantine sources suggest Kaleb transported tens of thousands of soldiers on hundreds of ships. He defeated Du Nuwas, who, according to one tradition, rode his horse into the sea and drowned rather than surrender. Kaleb installed a Christian viceroy in Yemen, and, for a brief moment, Aksum controlled territory on 2 continents. It was the zenith. It was also the beginning of the end. The problem with controlling both shores of the Red Sea was that it attracted the attention of larger powers. The Byzantine Empire, Aksum's nominal Christian ally, watched nervously. Persia, the Sasanian Empire, watched hungrily. Within decades, the Aksumite viceroy in Yemen was overthrown by a local rebellion, and Persia moved in. By 570, the year tradition assigns to the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, Yemen was a Persian province. Aksum had lost its foothold in Arabia, and with it, a critical piece of its commercial network. But the real catastrophe was still coming. It arrived not as an army, but as an idea. In the early 7th century, Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and force that reshaped the entire ancient world. The first followers of Muhammad, persecuted in Mecca, actually fled to Aksum around 615, where the Aksumite king granted them asylum in an episode remembered in Islamic tradition as the first Hijrah. The Prophet himself reportedly instructed his followers to leave the Aksumites in peace, saying they were a people among whom none was oppressed. But within a generation, the situation reversed. Arab-Muslim fleets took control of the Red Sea. The old trade routes that had fed Aksum for centuries were rerouted through new Islamic ports. Adulis, once one of the busiest harbors in the world, declined and eventually was abandoned. Without its port, Aksum was cut off from the commercial oxygen it needed to survive. The kingdom did not collapse overnight. It contracted. It turned inward. The highlands, once a launch pad for expansion, became a refuge. The Aksumite kings retreated deeper into the plateau, and the gold coins stopped being minted. The last known Aksumite coin dates to roughly the early 7th century. After that, silence, and then came the fire. Around the year 960, a figure emerged from the shadows of Ethiopian tradition whose name still carries the weight of destruction. She is called Gudit, or Yodit, or sometimes Judith. The sources disagree on almost everything about her religion, her ethnicity, her motives, even whether she was a real historical person or a composite legend. What they agree on is what she did. According to Ethiopian chronicles and corroborating accounts from the Arab historian Ibn Hawqal, who wrote around 977, a queen rose against the last Aksumite rulers. She may have been Jewish or pagan, or a follower of a local religion displaced by Christianity. She may have been from the Agau people of the Central Highlands or from the Sidama regions to the south. What is certain is that her forces swept through the Aksumite heartland with devastating fury. Churches were burned. The great stelae, those towering obelisks that had stood for 6 centuries, were toppled. The royal family was hunted, and according to tradition, the last Aksumite king fled to the island monastery of Debre Damo, a flat-topped mountain accessible only by rope, where he lived out his days in hiding. Ibn Hawqal, writing from a distance but drawing on merchant reports, described the devastation simply. The kingdom of Aksum, he said, had been overrun by a woman. The dynasty was finished. The silence that followed lasted centuries. The Aksumite dynasty was replaced eventually by the Zagwe dynasty, which built its own wonders, including the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly into the volcanic stone of the highlands. And the Zagwe were themselves overthrown in 1270 by the so-called Solomonic dynasty, which claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a lineage that would be maintained, at least in title, until Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974. But Aksum itself, the city, the empire, the idea, had been gone for 300 years before the Solomonic restoration even began. By the time European explorers reached the Ethiopian highlands in the 16th and 17th centuries, Aksum was a small, dusty town with enormous stone pillars jutting from the ground like the bones of a buried giant. No one could explain who had built them. The rediscovery of Aksum's significance came slowly. In the 19th century, European travelers and archaeologists began to piece together the fragments. The German scholar August Dillman reconstructed the Ge'ez language. The British expedition to Magdala in 1868, a punitive campaign against Emperor Tewodros II, brought hundreds of Ethiopian manuscripts back to London, where scholars began to understand the depth and continuity of Ethiopian literary culture. In the 20th century, archaeological excavations at Aksum, Adulis, and Matara revealed the scale of the kingdom, its palaces, its churches, its elaborate tombs, and its vast network of trade connections. The Stele Field at Aksum was recognized as one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Africa. The tallest stele ever erected, A monster of carved granite that may have stood 33 meters high, taller than any Egyptian obelisk, had fallen and shattered, probably during or shortly after its installation. But smaller stelae still stood, and the so-called obelisk of Aksum, 24 meters tall and intricately carved to represent a multi-story building with false doors and windows, had been looted by Mussolini's forces in 1937, shipped to Rome, and erected near the Circus Maximus as a trophy of conquest. It was returned to Ethiopia only in 2005, 68 years later, and re-erected in Aksum in 2008. That return was treated in Ethiopia as a national resurrection. And here is where the story of Aksum refuses to stay buried. The kingdom did not leave behind a civilization that ended. It left behind a civilization that continued. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, traces its origins directly to Frumentius and Ezana. Its liturgical language is Ge'ez, the language of the Aksumite inscriptions. Its calendar, which runs roughly 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorian calendar, descends from Aksumite timekeeping. Its artistic tradition, the wide-eyed saints and angels painted on church walls across the highlands, carries visual echoes of Aksumite aesthetic sensibilities filtered through centuries of isolation and devotion. Ethiopia's unique position in African history, the only country on the continent never permanently colonized by a European power, is inseparable from the legacy of Aksum. When Emperor Menelik II defeated the Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the most significant military victories of the colonial era, he did so as the heir of a tradition that stretched back to Ezana and Kaleb, a tradition that said this highland kingdom bowed to no foreign ruler. When the African Union chose Addis Ababa as the site of its headquarters, it was choosing the capital of a country whose independence was itself a monument to ancient sovereignty. And in the city of Aksum today, inside a small chapel guarded by a single monk, there sits what the Ethiopian church claims is the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-covered chest that the Bible says held the original tablets of the 10 Commandments. No one outside the guardian is allowed to see it. No scholar has examined it. No camera has photographed it. Whether it is truly the Ark, or a medieval replica, or something else entirely, almost does not matter. What matters is that for more than 1,000 years, generation after generation of Ethiopians has believed that the most sacred object in the Judeo-Christian tradition rests in their care, in a chapel in a small town in the northern highlands, guarded not by an army, but by one man's faith. That belief is Aksum's final, most enduring monument. Not stone, not gold, not military power, but the unbroken conviction that this place, this plateau above the Red Sea, this land of cool air and dark soil and ancient script, has always mattered. That it mattered when Mani listed it alongside Rome. That it mattered when Ezana carved his cross into gold. That it mattered when Kaleb sailed to Arabia. And that it matters still, even now, even after the empire that history erased refused, stubbornly and quietly, to disappear.